Whitechapel, London. 3:40 in the morning. August 31st, 1888. A man walking to work finds a woman lying in the street. He thinks she is drunk. He looks more closely. He runs for a police constable. By the time the constable arrives, it is clear that Ann Nichols is not drunk. She is dead. And the manner of her death, the nature of the injuries, is unlike anything the Whitechapel police have seen before. Nobody knows it yet, but this is the beginning of the most famous murder investigation in history. The killer will never be caught. The case will never be closed. And 135 years later, we are still talking about it. Turn off the lights. Pull the blanket up. And tonight, we're going to Victorian London, to the fog and the gas lamps and the narrow streets of Whitechapel in the autumn of 1888. This is the story of the most famous unsolved murders in history. Not just the crimes themselves, but the investigation, the suspects, the letters, and the question that has never been answered. Who was Jack the Ripper? How does a killer commit 5 murders in the most densely populated city on Earth and vanish completely, in 1888, before forensic science, before fingerprinting, before almost any of the tools we now take for granted in criminal investigation? Why has this particular case fascinated people for over a century when murders were tragically common in Victorian London? And does the killer's identity actually matter anymore? Or has Jack the Ripper become something else entirely? London, 1888. The largest city in the world. 4 million people, the capital of the British Empire, the center of global trade and finance. And within it, Whitechapel, one of the poorest and most densely populated districts in the East End, home to immigrants, casual laborers, the desperately poor, and the women who survived on the margins of Victorian society. Gas lamps, cobblestones, narrow courts and alleys, the smell of the river and the slaughterhouses. Whitechapel in 1888 was a place where life was cheap and death was common, from disease, from poverty, from violence. Which is part of what makes the Ripper case so remarkable. In a district where terrible things happened regularly, 5 murders stood out enough to terrify a city and captivate the world. Chapter 1. The world the women lived in. Let's start not with the murders but with the place. Because if you want to understand the Whitechapel murders, if you want to understand why they happened, why they were so difficult to investigate, and why the killer was never caught, you have to understand what Whitechapel actually was in 1888. And what it was unlike almost anything in the modern world. Victorian London crime is sometimes romanticized in the way we romanticize a lot of things about that era. The fog, the gaslight, the hansom cabs, the gothic atmosphere of it all. But the reality of life in the East End in the late 19th century was brutal in the most straightforward sense of the word. Whitechapel was desperately, chronically, structurally poor. Not the kind of poverty that is uncomfortable or limiting, the kind of poverty that kills you. The kind of poverty that means you do not know on any given night whether you will have somewhere to sleep or something to eat. The district had been absorbing waves of immigration for decades by 1888. Irish workers had come first, then Jewish refugees fleeing persecution in Eastern Europe, people who had crossed the continent with almost nothing, looking for safety and finding themselves in the most overcrowded corner of the world's largest city. The streets of Whitechapel and neighboring Spitalfields were genuinely teeming. The population density was extraordinary, families of 6 or 8 people in a single room, dozens of strangers sleeping in the common lodging houses that lined every street, the kind of closeness that sounds almost incomprehensible today. The economy of the East End ran on casual labor. There was no reliable employment in any modern sense. No steady wage, no contract, no security. Men waited at the docks hoping to be taken on for a day's work. Women worked in the rag trade, in match factories, in laundry, in charring, the endless, grinding, poorly paid domestic work that kept middle-class Victorian London clean and comfortable. And when that work wasn't available, or when poverty became so acute that nothing else was left, women in the district turned to another kind of survival altogether. This is where we need to be careful and honest, because one of the ways in which the Jack the Ripper story has always been told badly is in how it describes the women at the center of it. The 5 canonical victims, Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Jane Kelly, have often been referred to simply as prostitutes, as if that word tells you everything you need to know and excuses you from thinking about them any further. It does not. It doesn't even come close. The reality is more complicated and more human than that. Women in Whitechapel who engaged in street prostitution, and the evidence suggests this was true of at least some of the canonical victims at various points, did so because they were destitute, because they were often alcoholic, because they had been abandoned by poverty and by the institutions of their time, and because the alternative was to sleep on the street or go without food entirely. A bed in a common lodging house cost 4 pence a night. 4 pence. And if you didn't have it, you were out in the street. Street prostitution in 1888 Whitechapel was not a lifestyle choice. It was often the difference between a bed and the pavement. These were women who had ended up in the most desperate of circumstances, and they deserved to be known as people who had lived full lives before those circumstances caught up with them. Mary Ann Nichols, Polly as everyone called her, was 43 years old when she was found in Bucks Row in the early hours of August 31st. She had been married for 22 years to a man named William Nichols. They had 5 children together. The marriage had broken down. Accounts vary as to why, and the truth is probably complicated, as the truth about marriages always is, and by the 1880s Polly was living in the lodging houses of Whitechapel. By all accounts she was a cheerful person, someone who made the best of things. She had spent time in the Lambeth workhouse and had tried, more than once, to stabilize her life. On the night she died, she reportedly told the deputy of the lodging house that she had earned her DOS money 3 times over that day and had spent it. She would earn it again. She went out into the night confident she would be back. She was 43 years old, and she had 5 children, and she had a name. Annie Chapman was 47. She had been born into a family that was working class but not destitute. Her father was a soldier, and she had married a coachman named John Chapman in 1869. They had 3 children, Emily Ruth, Annie Georgina, and John. Emily Ruth died of meningitis as a child. Annie Georgina, it is believed, had some form of physical disability. The marriage deteriorated, likely worsened by Annie's drinking, and John Chapman died in 1886, which ended the small allowance she had been receiving from him. By 1888 she was in Whitechapel, living in Dorset Street, one of the most notorious streets in the East End, surviving day to day on whatever she could earn. She was also in poor health. The post-mortem examination would reveal that she had been suffering from a serious lung condition, among other things. She had been a person with a history and a family and a life. She was 47 years old. Elizabeth Stride was 45, and she was Swedish. She had been born Elizabeth Gustafsdotter in Gothenburg in 1843 and had come to London in her 20s, where she had married a carpenter named John Thomas Stride. She had no children with Stride, though over the years she told various stories about children she had lost. Some of these stories were demonstrably untrue, which tells you something about the inner life of someone who invents dead children, who needs to present loss as an explanation for where they have ended up. After the marriage ended, she lived in the East End, working as a seamstress and charwoman and surviving in the way women in her position survived. She was known to people in the neighborhood. She was a person other people knew. Catherine Eddowes was 46, and she was arguably the most vivid personality of the 5. At least as she comes across in the historical record. She had been born in Wolverhampton but had spent most of her adult life in London and elsewhere, traveling with a man named Thomas Conway for many years and having 3 children with him. By 1888 she was living with a man named John Kelly in Whitechapel, and by all accounts the 2 of them were genuinely fond of each other. They had been together for several years and Kelly would be devastated by her death. She was funny and sharp and known for singing when she'd had a drink. On the night she was killed, the night of September 30th, 1888, she had only just been released from the cells at Bishopsgate Police Station, where she had been held for being drunk and disorderly earlier in the evening. She had given the police a false name when she was brought in. She was 46 years old, and she was funny, and she had a man who loved her waiting for her to come home. And then there was Mary Jane Kelly, the youngest of the 5, and the most mysterious, because so little of what she told people about herself can be verified. She said she was from Ireland, that she had grown up in Wales, that she had been married and widowed and had spent time in France. Some of this may be true. She was somewhere in her mid-20s. The historical record is uncertain even about her exact age. She had been living in Miller's Court, off Dorset Street, with a man named Joseph Barnett, who sold fish at Billingsgate Market. Barnett adored her. He had, at various points, been supporting her so that she didn't have to go out on the streets. By early November 1888, the two of them had fallen out, reportedly because Kelly had allowed another woman to stay in their small room, which Barnett objected to, and Barnett had moved out. Kelly was behind on her rent. She was in her mid-20s, possibly beautiful. Descriptions suggest she was tall and fair-haired, and she was the last of the 5 women to die. The reason it matters to know who these women were, and I want to be explicit about this, is that one of the lasting and somewhat uncomfortable legacies of the Jack the Ripper case is that the killer has always attracted more attention than the killed. We have spent 135 years arguing about who he was. We have written thousands of books about him, made dozens of films, walked the streets of Whitechapel on guided tours in his name. And in all of that, the 5 women at the center of it, the actual people around whom this entire story revolves, have sometimes been reduced to footnotes. Names at the beginning of a chapter before we get to the interesting bit. That is a distortion of what actually happened. The interesting bit is them. The mystery is only interesting because they were real. So, we know who they were. Now let's talk about what happened to them. If you're finding this interesting, and we haven't got to the investigation yet, consider subscribing so you don't miss what comes next. New sleep history stories every Thursday and Sunday on the Still Hour. Drop a comment and tell me where you're listening from tonight. I read every single one. Back to Whitechapel. Because it's August 31st, 1888, Mary Ann Nichols has just been found in Bucks Row, and the investigation is about to begin. Chapter 2, The Canonical Five. There is a term that researchers and historians who study the Whitechapel murders use constantly, the Canonical Five. It sounds almost ecclesiastical, which is perhaps appropriate for a case that has become something close to a secular mythology. The Canonical Five are the 5 Jack the Ripper victims that the majority of serious investigators, then and now, agree were killed by the same person. And the reason they need to be identified as a group, as opposed to simply listing every violent death in Whitechapel in 1888, is that the autumn of 1888 was a period of extraordinary violence in the East End, and not every killing from that period can be attributed to the same hand. The number of Ripper victims is genuinely contested, and it's worth knowing that up front. Some researchers have argued for as few as 4, typically excluding Elizabeth Stride because the circumstances of her death were slightly different from the others. Some researchers at the other end of the spectrum have argued for as many as 11, grouping together a series of murders that stretches back to 1887 and forward into 1891. The Canonical Five are the ones that sit in the middle of that range. The cases that share enough characteristics, enough of a pattern, that most investigators agree they belong together. We'll talk about those characteristics in a moment. First, let's talk about what happened. Mary Ann Nichols was found at approximately 3:40 in the morning on August 31st, 1888, in Bucks Row, now called Durward Street, in Whitechapel. She had been out looking to earn her DOS money, and she had not come back. When the police constable arrived and then the divisional surgeon, Dr. Rees Ralph Llewellyn, it became clear that this was not an ordinary street death. The injuries were serious in a way that went beyond what the police in the district had encountered before. Llewellyn estimated she had been dead for no more than half an hour. The street was dark and quiet, and whoever had done this had done it without being seen or heard. 8 days later, on September 8th, Annie Chapman was found in the backyard of number 29 Hanbury Street, Spitalfields, not far from where she had been living in Dorset Street. She had been seen alive in the early hours of the morning, talking to a man outside the house. The man had said something to her. She had said something back. And then she was gone, and by the time she was found in the gray morning light, the case had become unmistakably the work of the same person who had killed Polly Nichols. The pattern was clear to the police by now. The injuries bore the same characteristics. Whoever this was, he had killed twice, in the same small area, within 8 days. Then came what is remembered as the double event, the night of September 30th, 1888, which stands as perhaps the most chilling single episode in the entire case. In the early hours of that Sunday morning, the Whitechapel murderer killed twice. Elizabeth Stride was found at approximately 1 o'clock in the morning in Dutfield's Yard, off Burner Street, now called Henriquez Street, in Whitechapel. The circumstances of her death were, as noted, slightly different from the others, which is why some researchers have questioned whether she was killed by the same person. She had been seen moments before her death in conversation with a man. A steward of a local club had come through the yard with his horse and cart and had almost run over her body. The killer, if it was the same killer, had been interrupted. What happened next, if you follow the theory that it was the same man, is extraordinary. Rather than fleeing the area entirely, within the space of about 45 minutes, he struck again, this time nearly a mile away, in Mitre Square in the City of London. Catherine Eddowes, who had been released from the Bishopsgate police cells less than an hour before, was found in Mitre Square at around 1:45 in the morning. The police constable who patrolled the square passed through it at approximately 1:30 and it was empty. The killer had found her, killed her, and disappeared in less than 15 minutes. The double event sent genuine terror through Whitechapel. It also sent the Metropolitan Police into something close to a panic. 2 murders in a single night, less than a mile apart, with no witness who could give a reliable description, no arrest, no suspect. The investigation was already under enormous pressure. After September 30th, that pressure became almost unbearable. And then, on November 9, 1888, 6 weeks after the double event, Mary Jane Kelly was killed. And this one was different in a way that is almost impossible to overstate. All of the previous murders had taken place outdoors, in the streets and yards and backways of Whitechapel, where the killer was exposed to the possibility of being seen, where the darkness and the fog were his only protection. Mary Jane Kelly was killed inside her own room, a tiny, single-room dwelling in Miller's Court, off Dorset Street. She had let someone in, or she had been followed in. The door was locked from the outside when the police arrived, and entry was gained by reaching through a broken window pane to turn the latch. The murder of Mary Jane Kelly was the most severe of the 5 by a significant margin. The killer had, for the first time, complete privacy and an unlimited amount of time. He had left the fire burning. He had spent what the medical examiner estimated may have been 2 hours in that room. What he did in those 2 hours was something that the newspapers of the time struggled to report and that I am going to describe only as far as is necessary to understand the significance of what happened. The injuries to Mary Jane Kelly were of a completely different scale to those suffered by the previous victims. The police officers who attended the scene, experienced men who had seen violence regularly, were visibly shaken by what they found. She was approximately 25 years old. She had been behind on her rent. She was the youngest of the 5. The pattern that tied these murders together, the pattern that investigators then and now use to identify them as the work of a single killer, involved several consistent elements. The victims were all women, all living on the margins of Whitechapel society. The murders were all committed at night or in the early morning hours. The method was consistent, and the murders were clustered geographically in a small area, Whitechapel, Spitalfields, and just into the City of London on the night of the double event. The killer knew the area. He moved through it with confidence in the dark. And then he stopped. ## Chapter 3, The Investigation. Let's talk about the people who were trying to catch him, because this is one of the aspects of the Jack the Ripper case that I think gets the least sympathetic treatment in popular history. The detectives and police officers who investigated the Whitechapel murders in 1888 are sometimes portrayed as incompetent, as bumbling, as hopelessly out of their depth. And that is fundamentally unfair. The investigation of the Whitechapel murders was not a failure of intelligence or dedication. It was a case that would have been extraordinarily difficult to solve even with tools that wouldn't exist for another century. The figure most associated with the investigation is Inspector Frederick George Aberline, and he is worth getting to know properly because he was a genuinely impressive detective. Aberline had spent years working in the East End before being assigned to the Whitechapel murders. He knew the district, he knew its people, he understood the geography and the social dynamics in a way that many senior Metropolitan Police officers did not. He was not a figure of fun. He was a careful, methodical detective operating under conditions of almost unimaginable difficulty, with the eyes of the world on him and none of the tools we now consider basic to criminal investigation. The conditions he was working under in 1888 represent one of the fascinating things about Victorian London crime from a historical perspective, because the autumn of 1888 sits right at the edge of the modern era of criminal investigation, close enough to the present day that we recognize the institutions and the concepts involved, but far enough back that almost nothing we now take for granted was available. Fingerprinting, the basic, elementary cornerstone of criminal investigation for most of the 20th century, was not used in criminal cases in Britain until 1901. Sir Francis Galton had been developing the theory, and there was growing scientific understanding that fingerprints were unique to individuals, but it had not yet been formalized into a system that police could use. It would not have been available to Aberline and his colleagues even if they had thought to look for fingerprints, which, in 1888, they had no particular reason to do. Blood typing did not exist as a concept. DNA analysis was nearly a century away. The forensic science that we now consider central to criminal investigation, the careful analysis of physical evidence left at a crime scene, the matching of that evidence to a specific individual, was in its absolute infancy. What Aberline and his team had was witness testimony, physical description, and their own intelligence and experience. The investigation began immediately after the discovery of Mary and Nichols. Local police officers were supplemented by detectives from the Criminal Investigation Department, the CID, and the investigation expanded in scope as it became clear they were looking at what we would now call a serial killer. The term itself didn't exist yet, at least not in common usage, but the concept was forming in the minds of the police by early September. The same person was doing this. Find the person. The police canvassed the district. They knocked on doors, interviewed lodging house keepers, spoke to anyone who had been near the murder sites at the relevant times. They assembled descriptions from witnesses who had seen women matching the victims' descriptions in conversation with men in the hours before their deaths. These descriptions varied wildly. A man of medium height, dark complexion, wearing a peaked cap. A man with a mustache, wearing a long coat. A man seen with Elizabeth Stride shortly before her death described as foreign-looking, respectable, possibly a clerk. A man seen with Catherine Eddowes described as someone of Jewish appearance, wearing a deerstalker hat. These descriptions were not necessarily of the killer. They were of men the women had been talking to, and the women, working on the streets, talked to many men. The difficulty of getting reliable witness testimony in Whitechapel in 1888 is difficult to overstate. This was a community with a complicated and often adversarial relationship with the police. Working class and immigrant communities in the East End had plenty of reasons not to trust the Metropolitan Police. They policed the district aggressively, they were often hostile to recent immigrants, and the relationship between the police and the very poor was not one of mutual confidence. Some witnesses may not have come forward because they didn't believe the police would help them, or because they feared involvement in a high-profile investigation, or simply because they were uncertain about what they had seen and didn't want to cause trouble. There was also the question of jurisdiction, which added an unexpected layer of complication. The murder of Catherine Eddowes in Mitre Square occurred in the City of London rather than in Whitechapel, and the City of London has its own police force, separate from the Metropolitan Police. This meant that two separate police forces were investigating connected murders, with all of the communication difficulties and institutional jealousies that implies. They cooperated broadly, but the coordination was not seamless. The Home Office and the public were demanding an arrest, and no arrest was forthcoming. The Metropolitan Police Commissioner, Sir Charles Warren, was under extraordinary pressure. Vigilance committees formed in the community, local men, mostly tradespeople and residents, patrolling the streets of Whitechapel at night in an attempt to do what the police apparently could not. One such committee, the Mile End Vigilance Committee, led by a builder named George Lusk, would become significant later in the case for a reason we'll discuss in a moment. What is remarkable, looking back at the Whitechapel murders investigation with knowledge of how criminal investigation has developed since 1888, is not how much the police failed to do but how much they managed to do at all. They interviewed hundreds of people. They followed up leads across London and beyond. They maintained surveillance on areas of the district. They were doing, with the tools available to them, everything that could reasonably have been done. The problem was not the investigation. The problem was the nature of the crime. Jack the Ripper, whoever he was, killed strangers, in the dark, in brief encounters, in an anonymous and densely populated neighborhood, and left almost no trace of himself behind. He didn't know his victims. He had no motive that left a trail, no money, no inheritance, no jealousy, no revenge. He appeared and disappeared. Even today, with DNA analysis and CCTV and digital records of movement, cases of this kind are genuinely difficult to solve. In 1888, they were almost impossible. Chapter 4. The Letters. On September 27, 1888, an envelope arrived at the Central News Agency in London. Inside it was a letter, handwritten, cheerful in tone in a way that reads as deliberately chilling, addressed to the boss. It began, "Dear Boss," and it was signed with a name that had not appeared anywhere in connection with the Whitechapel murders before that moment. A name that would go on to become the most famous alias in criminal history. The letter was signed, Jack the Ripper. The Dear Boss letter is one of the most analyzed documents in the history of Victorian London crime, and possibly one of the most consequential acts of media manipulation in the history of journalism, depending on who wrote it. Because the debate about the Ripper letters that dominated the autumn of 1888 and has continued among researchers ever since comes down to a fundamental question: were any of these letters actually from the killer? And the answer that most modern researchers have arrived at is, probably not most of them, possibly not the most famous ones, and almost certainly yes for one of them. During the autumn of 1888, the Metropolitan Police and various press outlets received hundreds of letters claiming to be from the Whitechapel murderer. The vast majority were obvious hoaxes, poorly written, factually wrong about the murders, written by people who were either seeking attention or trying to cause trouble or occasionally, one suspects, simply having what they imagined was a very funny joke. These were dismissed and most have been lost to history. 3 letters, however, have attracted sustained and serious attention from researchers across more than a century of study into the Jack the Ripper identity question. The Dear Boss letter, as noted, arrived at the Central News Agency on September 27, 2 days before the double event. It was written in red ink and included a cheerful, almost boastful description of the murders committed so far, along with a promise of more to come. The tone of it is notably different from what you might expect. Not tortured or remorseful or grandiose in the way of Gothic fiction, but almost businesslike, jokey, slightly showing off. The letter writer said he had been preserving something from one of the murders in a small bottle in order to send it to the police. Haha. He used the word funny about something he was planning to do. The name Jack the Ripper appears in the letter twice. And then he signed off as if he was writing a note to a colleague. 2 days later, on September 29th, a postcard arrived at the same Central News Agency. This one became known as the Saucy Jackie postcard from its opening address. It referenced the double event, the fact that 2 women had been killed on the same night, and it had been postmarked on September 30th, the morning the bodies were discovered. The timing of the postmark was used as potential evidence that the writer knew about the double event before it was publicly reported. The handwriting appeared to match the Dear Boss letter. The signature was the same, Jack the Ripper. These 2 pieces of correspondence gave the killer his name. The Central News Agency shared them with the police, and then, the precise sequence of events is still disputed, they were published. And once the name Jack the Ripper appeared in the newspapers, it spread with a speed that even in 1888, before mass media in any modern sense, was remarkable. Within days, everyone in London knew the name. Within weeks, the whole world knew it. The name was a masterstroke of branding, if you want to think about it in the most cynical possible terms: short, vivid, impossible to forget, carrying the perfect combination of menace and dark absurdity. Most modern researchers who have studied the Ripper letters believe that the Dear Boss letter and the Saucy Jackie postcard were written not by the killer but by a journalist. The leading theory, and it has been the leading theory for a long time, is that one or more journalists at the Central News Agency fabricated the letters in order to generate copy, to attach a name and a personality to the murders and keep the story running. The evidence for this is circumstantial but persistent. The tone of the letters matches a particular kind of journalistic writing from the period. The name was supplied at exactly the moment when public interest in the case was peaking and needed a hook, and serious researchers who have analyzed the handwriting have found reasons to doubt that the same person wrote all three of the major letters. Additionally, Inspector Aberline himself, the man running the investigation, the man who read everything sent to the police, told a journalist later in life that he believed the Dear Boss letter was a fake. The third letter is a different matter. In mid-October 1888, George Lusk, the builder who was running the Mile End Vigilance Committee, the group of local men who had formed to patrol the streets in the absence of a police arrest, received a small cardboard box in the post. Inside the box was a letter and, wrapped in paper, what appeared to be half of a preserved human kidney. The letter, written in a different hand from the Dear Boss letter, less polished, less performatively cheerful, more unsettling in a quieter way, claimed that the kidney had belonged to one of the women he had killed. It had been sent from hell, which is how this letter is known. Lusk initially assumed it was a medical student prank. The area was not far from the London hospital, and medical students had a reputation for this sort of macabre humor. But he had the kidney examined by a physician named Thomas Openshaw at the London hospital, who concluded that it was indeed a human kidney, that it belonged to a woman, that she had been approximately 45 years of age, and that it appeared to match the missing kidney of Catherine Eddowes. He also observed that the kidney showed evidence of Bright's disease, a kidney condition, and Catherine Eddowes was known to have been in poor health, consistent with this finding. The provenance of the kidney and the authenticity of the From Hell letter cannot be established with certainty at this distance. The kidney has long since been lost to history. But the weight of research opinion holds that the From Hell letter is the most likely of the three major letters to have been genuinely written by the killer. The handwriting is different, the tone is different, it was sent with physical evidence, and the content is harder to explain as a journalistic hoax. It does not name itself, does not call its writer Jack the Ripper, does not perform for an audience in the way the Dear Boss letter does. It is quieter and, in a strange way, more disturbing for that. Whether any of the Ripper letters were genuine will probably never be known for certain. What is certain is that the name they gave the world was indelible. Jack the Ripper is not the killer's name. It is a name that came from a letter, possibly a fake letter, written possibly by a journalist, and yet it has endured for 135 years, attached to one of history's most famous unsolved crimes, as permanent and as defining as if it had been carved in stone. ## Chapter 5. The Silence After. November 9, 1888. The morning light comes slowly to Miller's Court, because the court is narrow, barely more than an alley off Dorset Street, and the buildings on either side keep it dark well into the morning. John McCarthy, who was Mary Jane Kelly's landlord, sent his assistant Thomas Bowyer around to number 13 Miller's Court to collect the rent Kelly owed. She was several weeks behind. Bowyer knocked on the door and got no answer. He put his hand through the broken window pane, pushed aside the coat that had been hung over it as a makeshift curtain, and looked in. He went immediately to fetch McCarthy. McCarthy looked in too. And then they both went for the police. The investigation that followed the discovery of Mary Jane Kelly was the most extensive yet. Commissioner Warren, who had resigned the previous day, as it happened, over an unrelated dispute with the Home Office, had already departed. The investigation was in a state of some institutional chaos. Dogs were brought in the hope of tracking a scent. The house was examined carefully. A fire had burned so intensely in the small fireplace that it had melted the spout off a kettle. The killer had used it, investigators speculated, for light, feeding it clothing and other material throughout the hours he had spent in that room. A woman in an adjacent room said she had thought she heard someone call out in the night the word murder, but that calls in the night were common enough in Miller's Court that she had not got up to look. Nobody had seen the killer enter or leave. And then, with Mary Jane Kelly, the murders attributed to Jack the Ripper stopped. This is the fact around which all the subsequent theorizing has always orbited, because it is such a strange fact. 5 murders over 11 weeks, September 30th twice, November, and then nothing. The investigation continued. Aberline and his team were still working the case actively in 1889. The Whitechapel files remained open for years. And yet there were no more murders that investigators could place in the same sequence, no more nights when a woman was found with injuries that matched the pattern of the canonical five. Why did it stop? This is one of the central questions of the Jack the Ripper identity debate, and the answer you favor tends to reflect the suspect you find most plausible. If the killer died in late November or early December 1888, and one of the most persistent suspects in the Ripper case, a man named Montague John Druitt, did indeed die in circumstances suggesting suicide around that time, then perhaps the murders stopped because he was dead. If the killer was committed to a lunatic asylum around the same time, then perhaps he was simply taken off the streets. If he moved, if he left London, traveled elsewhere, settled somewhere new, the murders would have stopped in Whitechapel while possibly continuing somewhere else, somewhere investigators weren't looking. Chapter 6: The Main Suspects. And that is where the official investigation effectively ended. The murders stopped. The file stayed open. The killer, whoever he was, walked back into Victorian London and was never seen again, or at least, never identified. But the case didn't end. In many ways, it was only just beginning. Because what happened next, the century and a half of theories, suspects, books, documentaries, and obsessive detective work that followed, turned Jack the Ripper from a murderer into something else entirely. So, who did it? That is the question that has occupied researchers, criminologists, historians, armchair detectives, and professional obsessives for over 130 years. And the honest answer, the one that every serious student of the case eventually arrives at, is that we don't know. We genuinely, truly, frustratingly do not know. But that doesn't mean we have nothing to work with. Because the Victorian investigators, for all their limitations, did identify suspects. They wrote memos. They kept files. And those files, when they were eventually released to the public in the 20th century, gave researchers a starting point. Several starting points, in fact. So let's walk through the most serious ones, and I want to be fair here, because these were real people, and the weight of suspicion is not something to throw around lightly. The suspect who has attracted the most sustained modern attention is a man named Aaron Kosminski. He was a Polish-Jewish immigrant living in Whitechapel at the time of the murders, a hairdresser by trade, a deeply troubled man by most accounts. He suffered from what we would today recognize as severe paranoid schizophrenia, and he was eventually committed to a lunatic asylum in 1891. What makes Kosminski significant isn't just that he lived in the right neighborhood at the right time, though he did. It's that senior Metropolitan Police officials named him as a prime suspect in contemporary documents written close to the time of the murders, by men who were actually running the investigation. Chief Constable Melville Macnaghten listed Kosminski by name in a memorandum written in 1894. Assistant Commissioner Robert Anderson went further, claiming in his memoirs that the killer was a Polish Jew who had been positively identified by a witness. Though he didn't name Kosminski directly, the description has long been taken to refer to him. Then, in 2014, things got more interesting, or more complicated, depending on how you look at it. A researcher named Russell Edwards published a book claiming that DNA analysis of a shawl, allegedly found near one of the murder scenes, linked Kosminski to the crime. The claim made international headlines. And it genuinely would have been extraordinary, a 135-year-old cold case cracked by modern science. Except that the scientific community was, to put it gently, unconvinced. Geneticists who reviewed the methodology raised serious and substantial objections. The chain of custody for the shawl was essentially unverifiable. There's no reliable way to confirm where the shawl actually came from, who handled it, or whether it was anywhere near a crime scene in 1888. The DNA results themselves were contested. Most mainstream scientists who looked at the study considered it far from conclusive. So Kosminski remains a serious suspect, perhaps the most serious suspect, but the case against him is not closed, and it certainly isn't proven. The second major suspect is Montague John Druitt, and his story has a particular melancholy to it. Druitt was a barrister and schoolteacher, educated, middle class, from a respectable family, who drowned in the Thames in December 1888, just weeks after the final canonical murder. His body was found in the river on the last day of the year. He left a note suggesting he feared he was going insane. And Melville Macnaghten, the same chief constable who named Kosminski, also named Druitt in that 1894 memorandum, suggesting that police believed the murders stopped because the killer had taken his own life. It's a compelling theory, and you can see why it appealed to the Victorian investigators. The timing does align. A mentally unwell man, whose family reportedly suspected him of something terrible, dying by suicide at exactly the moment the murders ceased, that is not nothing. But the evidence against Druitt is entirely circumstantial. There is no physical evidence connecting him to any of the murders. No witness placed him at any crime scene. His link to Whitechapel is tenuous at best. And the suggestion that police privately believed the killer was dead doesn't mean they were right. It means they hoped the nightmare was over, which is a very human response, but not the same thing as proof. Then there is the most dramatic suspect of all, the one that launched 1,000 conspiracy theories and gave the Ripper case an entirely different dimension. Prince Albert Victor, Duke of Clarence, was the grandson of Queen Victoria and second in line to the throne. His alleged involvement in the Whitechapel murders is one of the most persistent theories in the entire canon of ripperology, and it is also, by the assessment of virtually every serious modern historian, essentially impossible. The theories take various forms. Some suggest Albert Victor himself was the killer, others that he was implicated in a royal cover-up involving Freemasons or government officials. The most elaborate version, popularized in the 1970s and later incorporated into Alan Moore's graphic novel and the film From Hell, involves a conspiracy so vast and so intricate that it makes Victorian London sound like a Bond film. And here's the thing, it makes for a fantastic story. But the historical evidence simply doesn't support it. Albert Victor's movements during the autumn of 1888 are documented. He was nowhere near Whitechapel on the nights in question. The original source for the royal conspiracy theory has been largely discredited. Modern historians who have examined the claim carefully have found it to be built on fabrication and wishful thinking rather than evidence. And yet the theory persists because it fits a narrative, the idea that the establishment protected its own, that the truth was buried by powerful men, that the real villain was not some disturbed man from Whitechapel but someone with everything to lose. It's a story about power and cover-up, and those stories are irresistible, which is exactly why this one won't die. The fourth suspect I want to mention is Francis Tumblety, who is perhaps less well known than the others but has attracted serious attention in recent decades. Tumblety was an American, a flamboyant, self-promoting patent medicine seller who had a long history of legal trouble in the United States before arriving in London. He was in London during the autumn of 1888. He was arrested in November of that year, not for the murders, but on separate charges, and then jumped bail and fled back to America. Years later, a senior Scotland Yard official named him as a Ripper suspect in a letter to an American colleague. Tumblety had, by various accounts, an intense and disturbing hostility toward women. He is taken seriously by a number of researchers, though again, the evidence is circumstantial and no definitive link to the murders has ever been established. So there you have it. 4 serious suspects, each with something in their favor and significant gaps in the case against them. And over 200 named suspects in total across the full span of Ripper research. Candidates ranging from Lewis Carroll to the artist Walter Sickert to the physician Sir William Gull. The honest conclusion, after all of it, is this: no one has been definitively proven guilty. The case is genuinely open. And anyone who tells you they know for certain who Jack the Ripper was is telling you more about their own confidence than about the evidence. Chapter 7. Ripperology. There is a word, a real word, used by researchers and enthusiasts without apparent embarrassment, that describes the study of the Jack the Ripper case. That word is ripperology. And the world of ripperology is one of the stranger subcultures you will encounter anywhere in the study of history or true crime. It encompasses professional historians and amateur investigators, retired police officers and university academics, novelists and genealogists, and retired schoolteachers who have spent decades in archive rooms poring over Victorian census records. It has produced hundreds of books, thousands of academic and semi-academic articles, multiple serious peer-reviewed studies, an entire museum in the East End of London, walking tours that run every night of the week, and a global community of enthusiasts who gather at conferences, correspond in journals, and debate the fine points of evidence with a passion that would not seem out of place in any academic discipline. And when you first encounter this world, you might find yourself asking a question that feels slightly uncomfortable to ask out loud. Why? Why this particular case? Why this particular killer among the thousands of unsolved murders in human history? What is it about the autumn of 1888 and a series of crimes committed in the fog of the East End that has generated this extraordinary, sustained, century-spanning fascination? Part of the answer is the setting. If you were designing a mystery story from scratch, if you sat down with a blank page and tried to create the perfect atmospheric backdrop for a tale of unknown menace, you would probably invent something very close to Victorian Whitechapel. The gas lamps, the cobblestones, the fog that rolled in off the Thames and swallowed the narrow streets whole, the cries of the costermongers and the smell of the leather yards and the sound of boots on wet stone in the darkness. Victorian London is a setting that has a kind of mythological weight to it. We have absorbed it through decades of fiction, through Conan Doyle and Dickens and 100 adaptations, and it sits in the imagination as the perfect setting for Gothic mystery. The Ripper murders happened in the right place at the right time to become a story, in a way that similar crimes in other settings might not have. Part of the answer is the name. Jack the Ripper sounds like a character from a penny dreadful, the cheap, lurid serialist fiction that Victorian readers consumed in enormous quantities. It has a theatrical quality, a kind of grim panache, that has lodged itself in the cultural imagination in a way that a more mundane designation never could. The name came from the letter, the Dear Boss letter, whose authorship is itself disputed, and it gave the killer an identity, a persona, almost a brand. That is a disturbing thing to observe, but it is true. The name is part of why this case persists. And part of the answer is the genuine historical puzzle. This is a real unsolved mystery. There are real documents, real suspects, real evidence, however degraded. The case has a beginning and an end, a defined series of crimes in a defined window of time, and it has left enough of a paper trail that investigation is actually possible. It is not like trying to solve a crime from the ancient world, where the documentary record barely exists. The Victorian era is close enough that its archives are largely intact, its newspapers are digitized, its census records are searchable. A determined researcher can actually make progress. That genuine solvability, the sense that the answer might be just one document away, just one DNA analysis away, is part of what keeps people coming back. But there is a fourth part of the answer, and I think it requires a moment of genuine reflection rather than glossy fascination. The Jack the Ripper case has sometimes, often, been treated as entertainment, as a puzzle to be solved, an intellectual game, a backdrop for tourism and merchandise and film adaptations. The museum in Whitechapel has attracted criticism for presenting the murders in a sensationalized way. The walking tours, which take groups of tourists through the sites of the crimes on dark evenings, exist in a complicated moral space. There is something undeniably ghoulish about the way the case has been packaged and sold as an experience. And the five women at the center of it all, Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Jane Kelly, have sometimes been reduced to footnotes in the story of their own murders. Their names are known, their faces are sometimes reconstructed for documentary programs, but they have not always been treated with the full weight of humanity they deserved. They were not supporting characters in a mystery. They were women with lives and histories and people who mourned them. The Ripper case is, at its core, a story about their deaths. That is worth remembering, and the best of the Ripperology community does remember it. There has been a genuine and important shift in recent decades toward researching the victims as fully as the suspects, toward telling their stories rather than just cataloging the evidence of their ends. The fascination with the case is real and it is understandable. But the most honest version of that fascination has to hold two things at once: the genuine historical mystery and the genuine human cost. They are not separate things. They are the same thing, seen from different angles. Chapter 8. What modern forensics adds. One of the questions you hear most often when the Jack the Ripper case comes up in the modern era is some version of, surely with today's technology, we could just solve this? DNA, forensic profiling, digital databases, all of it applied to one of the most famous unsolved murders in history. It sounds like it should work. And the honest answer is that it is much, much harder than it sounds, for reasons that are genuinely instructive about both the case and the nature of forensic science itself. Let's start with DNA, because that is the most obvious tool people reach for. The Kosminski shawl is the most prominent example of a DNA analysis being applied to the case, and we have already touched on why the results were contested. But the problems with that particular study reflect broader problems with any attempt to use DNA evidence in the Ripper case. The fundamental issue is chain of custody, the principle, central to forensic science, that you must be able to account for where a piece of evidence has been, who has handled it, and how it has been stored, from the moment it was collected to the moment it is tested. Without that chain, you cannot know whether the DNA you are finding on an object reflects what was originally on the object, or whether it reflects contamination from decades of handling, storage, and exposure. For an item allegedly connected to a crime scene in 1888, a reliable chain of custody is essentially impossible to establish. There is no way to verify, with anything approaching scientific confidence, that objects claimed to be connected to the Ripper case were actually present at the crime scenes. Some items may be genuine. Others may be Victorian-era objects with no connection to the murders at all. And even if an item is genuine, the DNA record on it after 135 years of existence is likely to be a palimpsest of contamination from every person who has touched it since. This doesn't mean that DNA analysis has nothing to contribute to historical cold cases. It has produced remarkable results in cases from much earlier periods, under the right conditions, with well-preserved samples. But the Ripper case does not offer those conditions, and the results of analyses conducted so far do not justify the confident claims that have sometimes been made about them. Psychological profiling is another tool that has been applied to the case, and with somewhat more interesting, if still limited, results. The FBI's Behavioral Science Unit produced a profile of the likely killer in the 1980s, and various forensic psychologists have contributed their own analyses over the years. The broad picture that emerges is reasonably consistent. The killer was likely male, probably in his late 20s to late 30s, likely local to Whitechapel or very familiar with the area, possessed of some degree of anatomical knowledge, and operating as what modern profilers would call an organized offender, someone who planned his crimes, managed the risk of being caught, and was able to move through the area without attracting attention. This profile is genuinely interesting, and it does help narrow the field of suspects in a general sense. But it does not point to a specific individual. Psychological profiling is a tool for understanding patterns of behavior, not for identifying perpetrators, and it has significant limitations even in contemporary cases with abundant evidence. Applied to a 135-year-old case, its conclusions are suggestive rather than definitive. What modern forensic science has done most usefully for the Ripper case is not so much in the analysis of physical evidence as in the analysis of the documentary record. Digital archives have made it possible to search Victorian newspapers, census records, court documents, and police files in ways that were simply impossible for earlier generations of researchers. This has allowed historians to build much more detailed pictures of the suspects, the victims, and the geography of Whitechapel in 1888 than was previously possible. Researchers have been able to establish timelines, verify or refute alibis, and cross-reference information across multiple sources in ways that have genuinely advanced our understanding of the case, even if they haven't produced a definitive identification. The honest conclusion is this: modern science has given us better tools for asking the questions, but it has not yet given us the answer. The physical evidence is largely lost, degraded, or unverifiable. The documentary record is rich but incomplete. And the case remains, after all of it, what it has always been: a genuine mystery, approached with genuine care by investigators who deserve respect for the seriousness with which they have treated it, and with genuine humility about the limits of what we can know. Chapter 9. Why It Still Matters. History is full of unsolved murders. It is full of crimes that went unpunished, of perpetrators who lived out their lives without facing justice, of victims who were failed by the systems that should have protected them. So why does this particular case still matter? Not just as a puzzle, not just as a cultural phenomenon, but as history? What does the autumn of 1888 in Whitechapel actually tell us, beyond the narrative of the murders themselves? The answer, I think, has to do with the specific moment in time when the murders occurred, and the specific way in which they cracked open something that Victorian society had been working very hard to keep closed. Whitechapel in 1888 was not a place that respectable Victorian London wanted to think about. The East End was a world apart from the gaslit drawing rooms and prosperous high streets of the West End, a place of overwhelming poverty, overcrowding, disease, and desperation. The people who lived there were largely invisible to the middle and upper classes who ran the country. Immigrant communities, casual laborers, the chronically unemployed, men and women who survived by the narrowest of margins in conditions that we would today find almost unimaginable. Reformers had been trying to draw attention to these conditions for years. Charles Booth's Great Survey of London's Poor was being conducted at almost exactly the same moment as the murders, a monumental project that documented the reality of East End life in statistical detail. But surveys and pamphlets reach limited audiences. They require the reader to already care. The Ripper murders made people care whether they wanted to or not. The press coverage was unprecedented in its intensity and its reach. National newspapers reported every development, published maps of Whitechapel, described the narrow streets and the overcrowded lodging houses in detail. And in doing so, they brought the conditions of the East End into the consciousness of readers who had previously been comfortable ignoring them. Middle-class Victorians who had never set foot east of the City of London suddenly had a vivid, terrible picture of what life was like in the streets where these women had lived and died. They knew about the common lodging houses where fourpence bought you a bed for a night. They knew about the absence of street lighting, the inadequacy of the police presence, the desperate economic circumstances that placed women in danger night after night. Social reformers recognized the moment and used it. Politicians who had been arguing for housing reform, for better policing, for investment in the East End, found that they suddenly had an audience. The murders did not single-handedly transform Victorian social policy. The reforms that gradually improved conditions in the East End came from many sources and over many decades. But they contributed to a shift in public awareness that made those reforms more possible. Whitechapel became, for a moment, a place that the rest of London could not look away from. And that visibility, however it came about, had consequences. This is genuinely uncomfortable to sit with, because it means that 5 women's deaths, 5 women who deserved protection, who deserved the attention of their society long before a murderer made them newsworthy, had consequences that extended beyond the immediate tragedy of their lives being cut short. It means that their suffering contributed, in a way they never asked for and never agreed to a social conversation that eventually benefited people like them. That is not a clean or comfortable thing to celebrate. The women of Whitechapel deserved better than to be martyrs to a cause. They deserved to be seen while they were alive, not only because of how they died. And the fact that it took a series of murders to make the East End visible to respectable Victorian society is not a tribute to the Ripper's legacy. It is an indictment of the society that ignored those conditions until they became impossible to ignore. What the case reveals, then, is not just a mystery about a killer's identity. It reveals a society in the process of confronting, slowly, painfully, inadequately, the cost of inequality. It reveals the limits of Victorian justice, which protected the prosperous and largely ignored the poor. It reveals the way in which women who lived on the margins of society were considered less deserving of protection than those who lived at its center. And it asks us, from across the distance of 135 years, whether we have actually resolved those tensions, or whether we have just moved on to new versions of the same failures. That is why the case still matters. Not because the killer's identity is an interesting puzzle, though it is, but because the world that produced these murders, and the world that failed to protect these women, is a world that it is worth understanding. And because understanding it might tell us something useful about the world we live in now. Chapter 10. The Unanswerable Question. Over 200 named suspects. hundreds of books, dozens of documentary investigations, forensic analyses, archive searches, psychological profiles, handwriting analyses, genealogical studies, DNA tests, and still no answer. The question of who Jack the Ripper was, a question that has occupied some of the sharpest minds in criminology, history, and forensic science for over a century, remains genuinely, stubbornly, maddeningly open. Some researchers who have spent decades in the field have arrived at a conclusion that requires a kind of intellectual courage to state out loud. The case may simply be unsolvable. Not probably unsolvable. Not unsolvable with current technology, but potentially solvable in the future. But genuinely, fundamentally unsolvable. A mystery where the evidence is too degraded, too corrupted, too incomplete, and too contaminated by a century of handling and speculation to ever yield a reliable identification. The physical evidence is largely gone. The witnesses are long dead. The documentary record, rich as it is, has gaps that can never be filled. And any conclusion built on what remains will always have to carry an asterisk, a qualification, a caveat, an honest admission that we cannot be certain. Others continue to believe that the answer is out there, that the right document, the right DNA sample, the right genealogical connection is waiting in some archive or attic or museum collection, and that with the right piece of evidence, the case could be closed. This hope is not naive. Cold cases have been solved after decades, even after more than a century, by single pieces of evidence that changed everything. It has happened. It could happen here. But sitting with the possibility that it might not, that the question might simply remain unanswered, is its own kind of exercise. And I think it is worth asking what it means to care this much about a question we may never be able to resolve. There is something very human about the desire to name a perpetrator. We are storytelling creatures, and stories need endings. The Ripper case has a beginning, the late summer of 1888, the first murder, and a middle, the autumn of terror, the letters, the investigation, the panic, but it does not have an ending. The killer was never caught. The file was never officially closed. The story just stops, suspended in the November fog of 1888, unresolved. And that incompleteness is, I think, part of what keeps drawing people back. We want to finish the story. We want the satisfaction of the last chapter. And we keep reaching for it across the generations because the alternative, accepting that some questions do not get answered, is genuinely hard. But there is another question underneath the obvious one, and it is perhaps more interesting. Even if we could name the killer with absolute certainty, even if tomorrow a document emerged from some Victorian archive that placed an identified individual at every crime scene with irrefutable evidence, would that constitute justice? The 5 women of Whitechapel deserved justice in 1888 and did not receive it. They deserved a society that protected them and did not have one. They deserved to be mourned publicly and fully, and for the first decades after their deaths, they were largely remembered only as the killer's victims rather than as people in their own right. Whether naming their killer now, naming a long-dead person who cannot be prosecuted, cannot face consequences, cannot be held to account in any meaningful legal or social sense, would actually give those women anything that they deserved is a question worth sitting with quietly. Perhaps what the case offers us, in the absence of resolution, is something different from justice. Perhaps it offers us a reckoning, an ongoing confrontation with the limits of what we can know and the limits of what systems of law and society can provide. Perhaps the sustained attention that has been given to the 5 women of Whitechapel across 130 years, the research, the memorials, the efforts to understand their lives rather than just their deaths, is itself a form of bearing witness. Not justice, but something. A refusal to let them disappear entirely into the fog. The question of who Jack the Ripper was may never be answered. The question of whether the 5 women of Whitechapel mattered, that one, at least, we can answer. They did. They do. And remembering that even now, even in the small hours of a quiet night, is not nothing. So let's go back to Whitechapel. One last time, before you sleep. The streets are still there. Not as they were. Whitechapel has changed almost beyond recognition over 135 years. The leather yards are gone. The common lodging houses are gone. The gas lamps were replaced long ago by electric light, and the light itself has changed the character of the streets in ways that anyone from 1888 would find almost miraculous. The community that lives there now is different from the community that lived there then. Different languages, different textures, different rhythms of life. And yet the geography is still broadly the same. The streets still turn where they turned. Some of the buildings still stand. And if you walk there on a quiet evening, and people do every evening on those walking tours, you can find the spots where the geography lines up with the history, where the old maps overlay the new reality, where you can stand and feel the shape of what happened there. The cases are still open. That is not a metaphor. The Metropolitan Police never officially closed the Whitechapel murders file. There is no verdict. There is no closure in the bureaucratic sense, the legal sense, the final sense. The autumn of 1888 remains, in the formal record of British policing, an unsolved series of crimes. The file exists. The case is open. The killer was never identified. And somewhere in the anonymous population of Victorian London, in the streets and courts and lodging houses and workplaces of that vast, teeming, unequal city, a person whose name we may never know returned to their life after November 1888. They woke the next morning and the morning after that. They walked streets that were now quiet, past a city that was slowly exhaling with relief. Whether they felt guilt or fear or nothing at all, we cannot know. Whether they lived long or died young, whether they are listed in a census record that someone has already found but not yet connected, whether their name appears in a Victorian archive waiting for the right pair of eyes, we cannot know. They were never seen again. Or rather, they were never identified. The difference between those two things is exactly where the mystery lives. Now rest. Whitechapel is quiet tonight. It usually is. The fog has lifted, the gas lamps have long since gone dark, and the streets are still. Mary and Annie, Elizabeth, Catherine, and Mary Jane, 5 women who deserved so much more than history gave them, are part of the city now in a way that goes beyond memory. Their stories have been told more times than they ever could have imagined. Whether that is justice or merely its shadow is a question that has no clean answer. Some mysteries exist not to be solved, but to remind us that justice is not always achievable, that the world sometimes fails people, quietly and completely, and that the most honest thing we can do is acknowledge that failure, hold it, and refuse to let it be forgotten. That is a heavy thing to carry into sleep, but it is an honest one. And sometimes the truth, even when it is incomplete, even when it is unresolved, is the most restful thing of all. Good night.